My dad declared, "We sold the mansion for $40 million. You need to leave tonight." I checked the deed and asked, "Then why is my name still on it?" Whatever it was, he already knew, and he'd spent 15 years hoping I never would. "Daniel," I said into the phone, still standing in the foyer with my father 3 feet away and my sister's face gone the color of skim milk. "Where am I meeting you?" "There's a diner on Route 9, the Millhaven Griddle. 2 miles from the courthouse. I'll be in the back booth. Come alone." A pause. "And Josephine, bring whatever documentation you have on the trust. All of it." I hung up before my father could say anything else, though I felt his hand close around my wrist as I turned for the door. Not hard, just enough to make a point. "Joe, think about what you're doing." "I have been," I said, "for 2 years." I pulled my arm free and walked past the moving truck idling at the curb, past the neighbors on their lawns pretending not to watch, and got into my Camry with my hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. In the rearview mirror, I could see my father standing in the doorway of a house that wasn't his, watching me leave the way you watch a fuse burn down to something you already know is going to go off. I need to back up because none of this, the deed, the lawyer, the 2 years of quiet work, happened the way people assume when they hear she checked the county records and found out her name was on the title. It wasn't a hunch. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March 26 months earlier when I drove out to Grandpa's house to help my father sort through the last of the file boxes in the attic, boxes nobody had touched since the funeral. Grandpa Walter Calloway built Calloway Precision Tool Company out of a rented machine shop in 1968 with $11,000 and a war surplus lathe. By the time I was born, it employed 340 people in Millhaven, Pennsylvania, made precision components for aerospace subcontractors, and had a pension fund he was proud enough of that he used to talk about it at Thanksgiving, the way other grandfathers talked about golf handicaps. He was 78 when he died. I was 30. I remember exactly how it felt to lose him because it was the only grief in my life that had never once been complicated by anything else. No anger sitting underneath it, no unfinished argument, just missing him. That afternoon in the attic, going through a box labeled Company, Misk in his cramped block handwriting, I found a green accordion folder that didn't belong with the rest. Inside were photocopies of wire transfer authorizations, 12 of them, spanning 8 years, each one routing money out of the Calloway Precision Tool Company Pension Trust into an account for something called Meridian Fabrication Partners, LLC. I didn't know what Meridian Fabrication Partners was. I'd never heard of it, but I recognized the signature authorizing every single transfer because I'd watched that exact signature go on birthday cards my whole life, my father's. I told myself it was nothing, the way you do. Loans between related entities happen all the time in family businesses, I reasoned, standing there in that attic with dust in my throat and my heart doing something strange and heavy in my chest. Maybe Meridian was a subsidiary. Maybe Grandpa knew. I put the folder back exactly where I found it because some instinct older than logic told me not to let my father see me holding it, and I didn't say a word to anyone for 6 weeks. Then I looked up Meridian Fabrication Partners, LLC on the Pennsylvania Department of State's Business Registry on a laptop at the Millhaven Public Library instead of my own computer, because by then some part of me already understood I didn't want this search showing up anywhere near my name. The registered agent was a man named Craig Delacroce, a name I recognized. My father's college roommate, the best man at his wedding, a man who ran what he called a consulting firm out of a UPS store mailbox 2 towns over. Meridian Fabrication Partners had never fabricated anything. It had no employees, no facility, no equipment. It had a bank account that received wire transfers from the Calloway Pension Trust, and as far as I could find in 18 months of careful, after-hours digging, existed for no other purpose than to receive them. I did try to fix it once, before I understood there was nothing simple left to fix. About 4 months after the library search, I brought Meridian up at dinner, as lightly as I could manage, framing it as idle curiosity. "Hey, whatever happened to that consulting thing Craig used to run?" My father didn't even look up from his plate. "Oh, that folded years ago. Craig's terrible with money. Always has been." "Why do you ask?" He said it so easily, so completely without hesitation, that I spent the next 3 days second-guessing everything I'd found, wondering if I'd built a conspiracy out of ordinary paperwork, the way people do when they want a reason to be angry at someone. That was the moment I understood how good he actually was at this. Not the theft itself, but the performance around it, the specific talent for making you doubt your own eyes instead of his. I never brought it up again out loud. I just kept digging quietly, and I stopped giving him the chance to talk me out of what I already knew. That was the beginning, not the deed. The deed came 14 months later, after I'd already pulled Grandpa's original 1987 trust document from the county recorder's office on a slow Thursday during my lunch break, sat in my car in the parking lot, and read the amendment he'd filed 9 months before he died, the one naming me, specifically, as the sole beneficiary of the Larkspur Lane property upon my 30th 30th birthday, superseding every prior version. I'd turned 30, 2 years before my father stood in that foyer and told me to be gone by tonight. I had simply never told him I knew. The Millhaven griddle smelled like burnt coffee and bacon grease, and Daniel Reed was sitting in the back booth exactly where he said he'd be, a legal pad in front of him covered in handwriting so small it looked like it had been compressed on purpose. He was maybe 50, gray at the temples, wearing the kind of suit that had clearly been worn since 7 that morning, and was starting to show it. 15 years in real estate transactional law, he said, before I'd even sat down, sliding a business card across the table. I represent Hargrove Holdings, the buyer on your father's sale. I want to be straight with you about something, because in about 6 hours I have to send my client a memo that's going to blow up a $40 million closing, and I'd rather you hear the reason from me tonight than read about it in a court filing next week. I'm listening. Standard practice on a deal this size. My client orders a full title history and an independent structural and environmental survey before anything closes. The title company flagged the chain of ownership 2 days ago. Your father's name never appears as record owner after 2011. That's when your grandfather's amended trust took effect. Your father's been paying the taxes and living there under what the trust technically allows, a life estate provision, but he never held fee title. He knew that. He signed a seller's affidavit swearing full ownership anyway, which is, depending on how a prosecutor wants to look at it, either a very serious civil problem or a criminal one. My hands had gone cold around my coffee cup. That's the fraud. What's the part that's worth more than the sale? Daniel turned the legal pad around so I could read it. The structural survey. My client hired a firm out of Pittsburgh, Halloran Engineering. They do pre-acquisition assessments on historic properties, and their lead engineer, a guy named Peter Okonkwo, 22 years doing exactly this kind of work, found something the blueprints on file with the county don't show. A subgrade room beneath the original wine cellar, poured concrete, steel door, no permit history anywhere. Your grandfather built it in 1974. According to a materials receipt, Okonkwo found wedged behind a support beam, the only paper trail of it that exists above ground. A bomb shelter. My stomach dropped the way it had in that foyer doorway an hour earlier, except this time it kept going, past the floor, past anything I'd braced myself for on the drive over. That's what it would have started as. Okonkwo couldn't get it open. There's a mechanical combination lock, no electronic keypad, nothing modern about it. But he ran a scope under the door gap and photographed the interior. Filing cabinets. Dozens of them. Daniel leaned forward. Ms. Calloway, my job tonight is to protect my client from closing on a house whose true owner was never a party to the sale. But I've been doing this 15 years, and I've seen exactly one other undisclosed subgrade vault, built by an aging company founder with a family he stopped trusting near the end. That one had a decade of embezzlement documentation in it. I think your grandfather built you a place to find the truth, and I think your father has spent 2 years trying to sell this house out from under you before you ever got the chance to look. I sat in that booth for a long moment, staring at a photograph on Daniel's phone of a rust-streaked steel door with a 5-dial combination lock, and felt something in my chest that wasn't shock. It was recognition. Grandpa had never been a sentimental man. Everything he built for a reason. I need a locksmith, I said. Tonight. Marcus Farrow had been opening safes for 31 years, the last 19 of them for insurance companies and estate attorneys who needed someone who could work a mechanical lock without a torch. He met us at the house at 11:52 p.m., his van's headlights cutting across a lawn still littered with the boxes Claire had started stacking by the curb before the shouting match sent everyone scattering. My father's car was gone. I found out later he'd driven straight to Craig Delacroce's house, which told me everything about what mattered to him more in that moment than watching his daughter walk back through a door he'd just tried to lock her out of. Marcus worked the dial for 40 minutes by flashlight while Daniel stood at the top of the cellar stairs on his phone with someone from his firm, and I stood close enough to watch Marcus's hands, thinking about my Marcus worked the dial for 40 minutes by flashlight while Daniel stood at the top of the cellar stairs on his phone with someone from his firm, and I stood close enough to watch Marcus's hands, thinking about my grandfather kneeling in this same spot half a century earlier, pouring concrete for a room he never once mentioned to me. The door swung open with a groan that sounded exactly like every horror movie I'd ever half-watched through my fingers, and underneath the smell of stale concrete and old paper, I found 16 filing cabinets, a roll-top desk with a single yellowed envelope propped against a green desk lamp, and taped to the inside of the door at eye level, a note in my grandfather's handwriting. Joe, if you're reading this, you turned 30, and Richard finally showed me who he really was. I found the wire transfers myself in 2009. I didn't confront him. I documented him instead, because your father has always been better at talking his way out of a room than he is at staying honest inside one. Everything's here. 8 years of it. Call Elena Cruz. She drew up the trust, and she's the only lawyer in this town I ever trusted with something that mattered. I love you. I'm sorry I didn't do this while I was still around to help you carry it. Grandpa, I read it 3 times before my legs would hold me up. Daniel Reed, standing behind behind me didn't say anything at all. He just handed me his handkerchief, which felt like the most old-fashioned gesture anyone had ever made toward me, and I used it, and I was grateful he didn't pretend not to notice that I needed it. Elena Cruz answered her phone on the second ring at 1:14 in the morning, which told me something about the kind of estate attorney my grandfather had chosen. 22 years practicing trusts and estates in Millhaven County, the kind of lawyer who apparently expected calls like this one. "Don't touch anything else in that room tonight," she said once I'd gotten through the essentials. "I mean it, Josephine. Whatever's in those cabinets is about to become evidence in a fraud case, maybe a criminal one, and if the chain of custody has a hole in it big enough for your father's attorney to drive through, all of it becomes worthless." I'm calling a colleague of mine first thing this morning, Patricia Nguyen. She's a certified fraud examiner, 20 years doing forensic accounting for exactly this kind of case. She'll photograph and log every page before anyone so much as breathes near it wrong. Patricia arrived at 8:40 a.m. with a folding table, evidence bags, and a level of calm that made me feel, for the first time since the phone rang the night before, like I wasn't the only adult in the situation. She spent the first hour just standing in the doorway of the vault, not touching anything, taking photographs of the room exactly as it sat. "People think forensic accounting is about the numbers," she told me, snapping on gloves. "It's about the story the numbers refuse to lie about even when everyone around them does." By noon, she'd cataloged enough to give me a shape of it, though the full accounting would take her firm another 6 weeks. Between 2003 and 2011, roughly $9.6 million had moved out of the Callaway Precision Tool Company pension trust into Meridian Fabrication Partners, in amounts small enough individually to avoid triggering the fund administrator's audit thresholds. My father, who'd taken over as company CFO after Grandpa stepped back from daily operations in 2001, had authorized every transfer himself, using his signing authority over the trust's investment account. Grandpa's own handwritten ledger, kept separately and cross-referenced against bank statements he'd apparently subpoenaed himself through a private investigator in 2009, traced where the money actually went. A failing chain of car washes my father had quietly owned through Craig Della Croce, bleeding cash for a decade before finally folding in 2014, 4 years after the embezzlement had stopped, or at least stopped showing up in the ledger. $9.6 million from the pension fund, Patricia said, plus whatever we find once we get into the company's current books, because I'd bet real money this didn't stop when your grandfather's private investigator's paper trail did. Men like this don't stop. They just get better at hiding it. I asked her the question I'd been afraid to ask out loud. "The pension fund, is it underfunded by about 11% as of the last actuarial report I could pull this morning," she said, not softening it, which I appreciated more than I could say. 340 employees. Some of them retired 30 years ago, counting on a fund your father treated like a personal line of credit. That's not embezzlement in the abstract, Josephine. That's somebody's retirement. My father showed up at the house at 2 p.m. with a lawyer of his own, a sharp, unhurried man named Victor Halloway, who introduced himself by handing me a cease and desist letter before he'd said a single word of greeting. It alleged that I had entered the property under false pretenses, that the vault's contents were the subject of ongoing legal dispute, and that any further access would be treated as evidence tampering, which struck me, reading it standing on my own grandfather's porch, as a remarkable thing for my father's own attorney to accuse me of, given that it was my father who'd tried to sell a house he didn't own out from under a vault he'd spent 2 years failing to find. "You don't understand what you've done," my father said, once Victor had run out of legal language and started improvising. "That money, I was going to pay it back. I always intended to pay it back. For 8 years? Business is complicated, Joe. You've never run anything. You don't know what it's like to watch something you built start to fail and have no way to stop it. You didn't build Meridian Fabrication Partners to save anything," I said. "You built it to hide where the money went. Grandpa's ledger has the wire transfer dates next to the car wash lease payments. It's not complicated. It's just theft with better paperwork." His face did something I'd never seen it do before. Not anger, not the practiced calm he wore like a second suit. Something closer to fear, the real kind, the kind that doesn't know how to perform itself because it's never had to before. "If you take this to the police, you're not just ending my career, you're ending the company. 300 jobs, Joe, is that really what you want on your conscience?" I thought about that for exactly as long as it took me to remember Patricia's voice that morning. That's somebody's retirement. And I understood, standing there, that my father had spent my entire life mistaking my quietness for softness, and he was about to learn the difference the hard way. "The company's not going to end because I told the truth," I said. "It's going to end, if it ends at all, because you spent 8 years stealing from the people who worked in it. Those aren't the same thing, and I'm done letting you pretend they are." Claire called me that night, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, she didn't sound like she was performing anything. "Dad had me co-sign something 4 months ago," she said, her voice thin. "A loan document against the Larkspur house, using it as collateral for a business line of credit. I didn't ask questions. I never ask questions, Joe. That's kind of the whole problem. problem, isn't it? A long pause. If the house was never his to put up as collateral, does that make what I signed fraud too? I didn't have an answer for her that night, and I told her so, because I'd learned enough in the last 18 hours to know that guessing at legal consequences over the phone at 11 o'clock was a good way to make things worse for both of us. But I also heard something underneath the fear in her voice that I hadn't heard from her in years. Not entitlement, not smugness, just a woman starting to realize that the ground she'd been standing on had never been solid, and that the person who'd built it that way was the same man who'd taught her to trust it. Talk to Elena Cruz, I told her. Not Dad's lawyer, mine. Tomorrow morning. Tell her everything. Before anyone tells you what to say. She did. By the following week, Elena had connected her with Detective Marcus Whitfield of the County Financial Crimes Unit, 14 years working exactly this kind of case, and Claire had given a full statement, the loan document, 2 other instances where our father had asked her to notarize signatures. She now realized she'd never actually watched him sign in front of her, a pattern of small complicities she'd talked herself out of questioning, because questioning our father had never once, in either of our lives, ended well for the person doing the asking. It didn't erase what she'd said to me on the stairs the night the moving truck sat outside, but it was the first time I'd seen her choose the harder truth over the easier lie, and I found I couldn't hold on to my anger at her with quite the same grip after that. My Aunt Diane called 2 days after that, my father's older sister, a retired kindergarten teacher who had spent every holiday of my childhood telling me I had my grandfather's eyes, and never once, in 32 years, called me without meaning something warm by it. She wanted to meet for lunch at the little Italian place on Grant Street where she used to take Claire and me for our birthdays, and some tired, hopeful part of me still wanted to believe this was just her checking in the way she always had. It wasn't. She waited until the breadsticks arrived to bring up Richard, her voice pitched low and careful, the way you'd talk someone down off a ledge they didn't know they were standing on. I'm not defending what he did, she said. I want you to know that first. But Joe, he's still your father, and prison changes a man in ways you can't undo once it's happened. Your grandfather would have wanted this handled inside the family, quietly. He always hated a spectacle. Grandpa built a concrete vault and hid a case file in it for 2 years so I'd find it after he died, I said. That's not a man who wanted this handled quietly, Diane. That's a man who didn't trust anyone in this family to handle it at all, except me. She set her fork down. You could still ask the district attorney to consider a civil resolution instead. Restitution, without the criminal charges. People do that. It would spare the company, spare your sister the embarrassment, spare— She stopped herself, but I already knew where the sentence had been headed. Spare him. I'm not doing this to spare anyone, I told her. I'm doing it because 340 people are counting on a fund he treated like his own checking account, and because Grandpa spent the last 2 years of his life making sure someone would finally say so out loud. I love you, Diane. I'm not going to let loving you talk me out of that. She didn't finish her lunch, and she didn't call again for months. When she finally did, it wasn't to relitigate the case. It was to tell me, quietly, that she'd started attending a support group for family members of white-collar offenders, and that she was sorry for the lunch, for asking me to carry his shame so he wouldn't have to. I understood, hanging up that phone, that I had lost more than one relationship built on the assumption that keeping my father comfortable was simply what the women in this family were supposed to do, and that I would make the same choice every time, because some kinds of peace are only ever paid for by the person the family has already decided doesn't count. Detective Whitfield opened a formal investigation 11 days after Marcus Farrow cracked that vault door, and the case moved faster than Elena had warned me these things usually do, mostly because Patricia Nguyen's preliminary forensic report gave him a paper trail so clean he didn't need to build one from scratch. He served a search warrant on Callaway Precision Tool Company's corporate offices on a Wednesday morning, seizing 11 years of financial records, and by Friday his office had subpoenaed Craig Delacroce's bank records for Meridian Fabrication Partners, which was when the number Patricia had estimated at $9.6 million grew teeth. Elena filed a temporary restraining order the same week, barring my father from the Larkspur property and from any contact with Patricia's audit team, after he showed up unannounced at Patricia's rented office space downtown and stood in the parking lot for 20 minutes, making phone calls loud enough that her assistant called building security. Judge Simmons signed it without a hearing, on an emergency basis, the kind of order Elena said she'd expected to need eventually, but hadn't wanted to ask for until she had to. My father never violated it. I think by then, even he understood how it would look if he did. Whitfield built his case file the way Patricia had taught me to read financial evidence, in exhibits, not accusations. Exhibit C was Grandpa's handwritten ledger. Exhibit D was the 12 original wire authorizations from the attic folder. Exhibit G, the one Whitfield said would matter most to a jury if it ever got that far, was a spreadsheet his own analyst built cross-referencing every Meridian deposit against a corresponding lease or maintenance payment on the car washes. Month by month, 6 years of theft laid out in a chronology apology that didn't ask anyone to trust a single person's memory, only the dates the banks had already recorded. Your grandfather's ledger only covers what he could document through 2011, the year he passed, Whitfield told me, in an office that smelled like the inside of an old file cabinet, not unlike the room I'd have to get used to visiting over the following months. Meridian's bank records show the pattern continued for another 4 years after that, once your father had sole signing authority and no one left watching. We're looking at closer to $14 million total, moved out of a pension trust covering 340 current and former employees. I sat with that number for a long time. $14 million is not an abstraction when you've spent a week learning the names attached to it. Men and women who'd spent 30 years on Grandpa's factory floor believing the fund with their name on it was exactly as solid as he'd always promised them it was. The crisis came on a Tuesday, 9 days after the vault opened, and it came the way these things always seem to, not with warning, but with a phone call from Elena at 6:40 in the morning. Victor Halloway filed an emergency petition last night, she said. He's asking the probate court to void your grandfather's 2011 trust amendment entirely on the grounds of diminished capacity, arguing your grandfather wasn't mentally competent when he executed it, and that the original 1987 trust, which named your father as primary beneficiary of the estate, should control instead. If Judge Loretta Simmons grants even a temporary stay this afternoon, it freezes everything, the house, the vault, all of it, while the competency question gets litigated. And Josephine, if that stay includes an order sealing the vault's contents pending review, Patricia's team loses access before her audit is finished. Whatever's still uncatalogued in those cabinets could sit locked up for a year, maybe longer, while your father's people find a way to argue it should never have been admissible at all. How long do I have? The hearing's at 4 o'clock this afternoon. I need everything we have showing your grandfather was of sound mind in 2011. Medical records, witness statements, anything. Buy 2. Or I'm walking into that courtroom with half a case. 9 hours. 9 hours to undo 2 years of my father staying one step ahead of everyone who might have caught him sooner. I spent the first 3 of them on the phone with Dr. Fiona Marsh, Grandpa's longtime internist, who agreed, after Elena explained the stakes, to pull his complete chart and provide a sworn statement confirming that a full geriatric cognitive assessment, a Montreal cognitive assessment, administered 8 months before the trust amendment, at Grandpa's own request, because he'd told her he wanted it on record before I make some decisions people aren't going to like, had scored him at 29 out of 30, no indication of impairment whatsoever. He had, it turned out, anticipated exactly this fight, and built a paper trail against it years before my father ever thought to start one. I spent the next 2 hours in the vault myself, under Patricia's supervision, searching for anything showing Grandpa's state of mind the week he signed, and found it in the roll-top desk, a handwritten letter to Elena Cruz, dated the same day as the trust amendment, laying out in his own precise engineering hand exactly why he was making the change and exactly what he expected me to do with what I found. It wasn't the letter of a confused old man. It was the letter of someone who'd spent 2 years quietly building a case, the same way I had. By 1:50 p.m., Elena walked into the courthouse with Dr. Marsh's sworn statement, Grandpa's letter, and Patricia's preliminary forensic summary establishing that the very embezzlement Victor Halloway was trying to argue didn't exist was independently corroborated by bank records the county's own financial crimes unit had already subpoenaed. Judge Simmons, 19 years on the bench according to Elena, not a woman who liked being handed a weak argument dressed up as an emergency, denied the petition for a stay outright at 4:47 p.m., and in language Elena said she'd never seen a probate judge use before, noted for the record that the timing of the competency challenge, filed 11 days after a forensic accountant discovered 8 years of financial irregularities, strains credulity past the point this court is willing to indulge. I found out by text, sitting in my car in the courthouse parking lot, and I put my forehead against the steering wheel and stayed there long enough that I lost track of time. Not relief exactly, just the sudden absence of a weight I'd stopped noticing I was carrying. Because I'd been carrying it for so long, I'd started to think of it as part of my own body. Detective Whitfield presented his findings to the district attorney's office 6 weeks later, and a grand jury indicted my father on charges of embezzlement, wire fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty tied to the pension trust. 14 counts in total, covering roughly $14, $1 million in misappropriated funds across 12 years. Craig Della Croce was indicted alongside him on conspiracy charges, Meridian Fabrication Partners having existed, prosecutors argued, for no purpose beyond laundering the transfers through a business that never actually built anything. Callaway Precision Tool Company's board, 5 members, none of whom had known about the pension fund's true condition until Whitfield's search warrant landed on their desks, voted unanimously to remove my father from his CFO position the same week the indictment became public, and hired an outside restructuring firm to stabilize the fund. The company itself survived. It turned out $14 million, while devastating to the pension trust specifically, hadn't touched the operating business Grandpa had actually built, which meant the 340 jobs my father had used as a threat against me were never the ones actually at risk. His own freedom was. A reporter named named Priya Sundaram, who covered business and labor for the Millhaven Sentinel Record, called me the week the indictment became public, and I almost let it go to voicemail out of habit before I picked up. She'd covered a school district embezzlement case 2 years earlier that put a superintendent in prison, and Elena had already vetted her enough to tell me she wasn't fishing for anything I hadn't already made a matter of public record through the court filings. "I'm not asking you to comment on the criminal case," she said. "I'm asking whether the employees at that plant deserve to hear, from someone who isn't a press release, that the fund is actually going to be made whole. They've spent 6 months reading rumors on a company message board. I think they'd rather hear it from you than from another anonymous post." I agreed to one interview. On the record, mostly for Grandpa's sake. The piece ran under a headline I still can't read without my throat tightening. "The granddaughter who found the vault, Walter Calloway left behind." And for 2 days afterward, 3 separate retired machinists stopped me outside the courthouse just to shake my hand. The pension shortfall got resolved in a way I hadn't expected, and still find myself grateful for most days. The vault's other filing cabinets, the ones Patricia hadn't fully cataloged before the hearing, turned out to hold more than embezzlement evidence. Grandpa had also kept a private investment account there, documented in meticulous detail, worth just under $6, more than embezzlement evidence. Grandpa had also kept a private investment account there, documented in meticulous detail, worth just under $6, $8 million, which the amended trust specified should go toward making the fund whole if it's ever broken. A line Elena said she'd read a dozen times over the years and never once understood until the day she finally needed to. Combined with a court-ordered restitution judgment against my father and the recovered value of Meridian's remaining assets, the pension fund came out of the following year fully funded for the first time in over a decade. Hargrove Holdings' $40 million purchase never closed, not in its original form. Daniel Reed's firm renegotiated directly with me once probate confirmed my clear title, and I sold them 40 acres of the estate's back parcel, never the house itself, for $6.2 million, enough to cover legal fees, the restitution shortfall my father's assets couldn't fully satisfy, and a fund I started in Grandpa's name for Calloway employees affected by the shortfall years before the restructuring resolved it. I kept the house. I understood, somewhere around the 3rd week of all this, that I had never actually wanted $40 million. I had wanted my grandfather's name to mean what he'd built it to mean. My father pleaded guilty 8 months later, 4 days before trial, to reduce the charge count in exchange for a recommended sentence at the low end of federal guidelines, 6 years, with a restitution order the court set at $8. $3 million, the difference between what Grandpa's investment account had recovered and what remained owed. At sentencing, he was given the chance to speak, and he apologized to the family and to the company's good name, and he never once said the word pension or employee or theft. Claire sat 2 rows behind me and cried the way I hadn't let myself, and when it was over, she reached over and took my hand, and for the first time in either of our adult lives, it didn't feel like a performance for anyone watching. Claire herself was never charged. Whitfield's office credited her cooperation, and the loan document she'd co-signed turned out, once Patricia traced it, to have been drafted specifically to shield my father rather than implicate her. One more small cruelty in a long list of them, using his own daughter's signature as cover the same casual way he'd used a pension fund. She still lives in Millhaven. We have dinner most Sundays now, something we never once did while our father was still the gravitational center of both our lives. It's been 14 months since Marcus Farrow cracked that vault door open by flashlight. I still live at the Larkspur house, alone, most nights, though Claire's over often enough that I've started keeping a second coffee mug just for her. I renovated the old wine cellar last spring, not the vault itself, which I left exactly as Grandpa built it, steel door and all, but the room above it, and I use it now as an office for the small foundation I started with what was left after restitution. College scholarships for children of Calloway employees, the kind of thing Grandpa used to talk about doing someday, back when someday still felt far away for both of us. Patricia Nguyen and I still talk occasionally. She told me once, over coffee, that in 20 years of forensic accounting she'd worked exactly 2 cases where the evidence had been assembled in advance by the victim himself, waiting patiently in a locked room for someone he trusted to come looking. Most people don't get that kind of gift, she said. Most people just get a mess and have to make sense of it after the fact. I think about that a lot. I think my grandfather spent the last 2 years of his life building me a door and trusting that I'd eventually be the kind of person who'd go looking for what was behind it. Daniel Reed sends a card at Christmas now, which still strikes me as an oddly formal thing for a man I met once at midnight in a diner booth, the night he chose to blow up his own client's deal rather than let it close on a lie. I asked him once why he'd bothered, why a real estate attorney working for the buyer would go out out of his way to protect the interests of the seller's own daughter, a woman he had absolutely no professional obligation to look out for. 15 years doing this job, he said. You see, a lot of families use property like a weapon. Every so often you get the chance to hand it back to the person it actually belonged to instead. I don't get that chance often. I wasn't going to let this one go past me because it was inconvenient for a closing date. I drove past the old Callaway Precision Tool Company plant a few weeks ago, on my way to the courthouse to finalize the last of the restitution paperwork. The parking lot was full, same as it's always been. 300 and some cars belonging to people who go home every night still trusting that the number on their pension statement means what it says. My grandfather built that trust with a war surplus lathe and $11,000. My father spent 12 years trying to hollow it out from the inside, quietly enough that he assumed no one would ever notice what was missing until it was too late to matter. He was wrong about that. He was wrong about most things in the end, but he was wrong about me most of all. He spent 15 years believing my quiet meant I wasn't paying attention, when really I'd just been waiting for the door my grandfather left me to finally open.